And this gets to the point, Josh, of tension between the federal and state governments over the handling of all of this. What was announced yesterday went to a more forward-leaning approach from the Commonwealth. To talk more about that, I'm joined now by the Defence Minister, Linda Reynolds. Minister, thanks for your time this morning. Just firstly, what is the latest information on the deployment of defence assets? Are further evacuations being planned?
Well, good morning, David. And yes, there are. So the latest news overnight on the defence engagement is that HMAS Adelaide, which is our very large amphibious ship, left Sydney yesterday and has now arrived in location off the south coast near Eden. And MV Sycamore and also HMAS Choules have dropped off their 1,100 evacuees at Western Port in Victoria, and they are now steaming back up to the south coast. We are in discussions with the New South Wales and Victorian government on how best to utilise these vessels today and moving forward. But all vessels are very capable, particularly HMAS Adelaide. So Adelaide has 400 troops embarked. We've got 300 tonnes of emergency relief stores. She's got a hospital on board. So there's a lot of things that we can do, but again, we're working with the authorities to make sure. Yesterday, the Prime Minister and I also announced that we are opening up defence bases between Brisbane and Adelaide to ensure that people in the local communities, if they need somewhere to stay, if they need some medical assistance, support or a hot meal, they will have somewhere to go in these defence bases. But the most significant announcement that we are enacting yesterday, was the call-out, the unprecedented call-out of up to 3,000 Army Reserve members in the states that are most affected by these bushfires. So we are enacting those arrangements today, including the standing up of 3 joint task force, which are essentially headquarters based in Sydney, Victoria and Adelaide, to ensure that Defence best coordinates all of our activities in those states and also works seamlessly with each of these state governments.
And that's what I wanted to ask you about, working seamlessly with state governments, you say. What's your reaction or explanation as to why Shane Fitzsimmons, the Rural Fire Service Chief in New South Wales, has expressed disappointment and frustration that he wasn't kept in the loop or consulted about this?
Well, David, the first thing I would say is that the National Security Committee of Cabinet met yesterday morning to put together this new suite of measures, not just on behalf of Defence but on behalf of the federal government. So straight after that meeting, the Prime Minister personally contacted each of the impacted premiers to advise them of the measures that we had agreed to take. So that was done before we went and made the public announcement.
Wouldn't you want to consult the guy who's actually in charge operationally about whether this was a good idea?
Well, the Prime Minister has been in constant contact with the premiers daily, in fact, in some cases.
I'm talking about Shane Fitzsimmons here, the Fire Commissioner.
David, please, you asked me a question, please just allow me to answer it. So the Prime Minister, as is absolutely normal, will let the state leaders know, and it is entirely a matter for the state authorities of how they communicate that through their own bureaucracy and their own emergency management processes.
OK, but so I'm not talking about communication there. My question, Minister, sorry, was about consulting. Wouldn't you want to consult with the operational chief to make sure this is a necessary step rather than simply making a decision and communicating it?
Well, David, you're conflating two issues there. The first one is in terms of the decision that the National Security Committee took yesterday, which was not only the call-out of the reserves, but also the other measures that we announced yesterday. And that was done in absolute consultation with the states in terms of what more resources are required.
So Shane Fitzsimmons was consulted about this?
I said that the state authorities were consulted.
Shane Fitzsimmons, was the Fire Commissioner consulted?
David, with respect, we have liaison officers at all of the impacted state headquarters. We've got liaison officers with incident controllers right across New South Wales. So we consulted very widely in terms of the resources.
This is an important point, though, Minister. Sorry to interrupt you.
David, again, just be talking over me.
No, I'm just wanting to get to the question here. The Commissioner said this morning that even the liaison officers that you're referring to weren't aware of the details.
David, that's the reason we have the liaison officers out there. I do acknowledge yesterday that Defence could have worked a little quicker to push the information out. We've acknowledged that yesterday, and we've put measures in place to make sure that our Defence chain of command have that information available as soon as possible. But I would say, in relation to the Commissioner of New South Wales, that information was passed to the Premier. Yep. So that information was communicated to the state authorities. But can I just make a couple of points, David? You asked me about what Defence is doing. Defence has been actively engaged. We've had over 2,000 men and women across Army, Air Force and Navy for the past 2 months, providing extensive support to state governments. We've provided everything that has been requested.
Yes.
But given the scale and scope and extent of these bushfires, yesterday the government announced new measures to make sure that Defence can provide the maximum possible support over the longer term.
Let me ask you about that. And look, Shane Fitzsimmons certainly has welcomed the support that's been there from Defence. I know you've got to go momentarily, but let me just ask you about the detail here. Okay. When the Prime Minister spoke yesterday about shifting the position from simply responding to state requests to instead having a more forward posture for Defence, what does that mean in practice? Who will be calling the shots on whether and when Defence assets are going to be deployed?
That still rests with the states and territories, absolutely.
So has anything changed?
Let me finish, David. That authority still rests with the states and territories, absolutely. But what we've found, this is an unprecedented natural disaster in terms of scope and Defence engagement. So what we have said to the states and territories, and what the Prime Minister clearly said yesterday, is we are ramping up even more assets and making it known through our liaison officer network of what the states right down to the local community level can ask for. And we are also moving...
That network, as you've said, has been there for a while.
You're talking over me again, David.
Sorry, is anything changing? I'm just trying to establish what's changed.
Well, David, so what that means is it is still finally the responsibility for the states and territories to ask and coordinate, but we are forward positioning. We're making equipment, and also we've activated reservists in these states to make sure that the states are very clear on what we can do, and we have the people and the resources in location so that they can respond very quickly. So we've now got, for example, with the Army, we've got specialist medical teams now available, engineering teams, transport teams, aerial reconnaissance, and also, of course, evacuation assets. So it is ultimately still the states and territories' call. But what the Prime Minister said yesterday is we are being as forward-leaning as possible to make sure that we have the maximum amount of resources available when the states ask for it.
All right, Defence Minister Linda Reynolds, I know you have to go. I appreciate your time this morning.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Josh and Joe, back to you.
David Spears, terrific to have you with us at the ABC.